And so I appreciate you being here. We'll try and keep this under an hour so you can get back to the rest of your days. My name is Brooke Anderson. I'm on staff with the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, which is sponsoring this community briefing today, along with the Consumer Federation of America, and we have Sue Peshin here representing CFA, and the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence. We have Catherine Griffith from Chicago, and Sue is from DC. And I'll introduce them more a little bit later on, but I just wanted to let you know a little bit about what's going to be happening today. First of all, I just want to make sure everyone should have a packet that has the agenda, fact sheets, information about healthcare consumers, a brochure, and a business card. If you didn't get one, they're up at the front. And just in case you haven't already signed in, please make sure to sign the sign-up sheet before you leave. That way, we can be sure to let you know about future events that we have regarding gun regulation and gun violence. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. Please feel free to help yourself to the refreshments. The agenda for the program today is we're going to do introductions, and then each of the three of us will be giving some brief statements about why our organization is supporting gun regulation, and then there'll be a time for us to talk about how you can personally get involved and get the communities that you work with involved in the gun regulation movement, and then there'll be time for questions. In the middle, we'll be showing you a brief video clip. So first of all, what I'd like to do is, I know there's so many people here representing different organizations. I'd love if there's time to just go around the room briefly and have everyone say your name, and if you're representing an organization or you're involved in a particular organization, say that and what you hope to get out of today's community briefing. So, showing that start at the front. Need to pick on you.
I'm Doris Jones, and I'm here as president of the Champaign County Art Teachers, and I hope to get information to take back to our membership.
I'm Laura Olson. I'm a former state representative, and I'm a candidate for the legislature.
George?
I'm George Mason. I'm on the staff of the healthcare consumers.
Hi, I'm Michelle Spaving. I'm, I would say, representing the Illinois Association of School Nurses, and also I'm on the Champaign County Board of Health.
Dave King, I'm the administrator of Champaign-Urbana Public Health District and Champaign County Public Health Department.
Debbie Sheldon, just an interested community member.
Mark Tinia Cook from Illinois Disciples Foundation.
I'm Matt Rakel. I'm president of Student Peace Action.
Chris Carter, I'm a volunteer for CCHCC.
Chris Boyster, I'm with the Springfield office of the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence.
Kathy Brinkman, and I'm with the Champaign County Million Moms March.
I'm Faith Henson. I'm a local nurse here as a private citizen pursuing this process. Linda Daltonheim with the Violence Prevention Program at the Illinois Department of Public Health.
I'm Gabe Nunez, and I'm just an intern here at Healthcare Consumers.
My name is Meredith Cruz. I'm just an interested community member.
Robert Dunn, a member of the Prairie Greens of Central Illinois, until we're into racism effort.
Art Sandro, Champaign County Million Mile March.
Claire Zook, Champaign County Million Mile March. Virginia Lucas, Champaign County Million Mile March.
Hannah Stevens, Student Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Yvette Anderson with the Champaign Park District Social Community Center.
Paulette Coleman on staff at the Healthcare Consumers.
I'm Claudia Lindhoff, and I'm with the Champaign County Healthcare Consumers.
Lloyd Carter Jr., not feeling so good today. Champaign County Board.
Great. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I hope this meets your expectations. I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about why Champaign County Healthcare Consumers is involved in this issue. Because many of you know the other work that we do around women's health and public health and medical billing in our hotline. So our involvement on gun regulation may be new to you, or you may have caught events that we've done about this issue in the past. I wanted to tell you why we're sponsoring this event. Healthcare Consumers is here basically to support the firearms Safety and Consumer Protection Act, a piece of legislation that Sue will give you much more information, detailed information on than I will give you. But basically the history is Champaign County Healthcare Consumers. We're a 24-year-old nonprofit grassroots organization, and we're founded on the belief that healthcare is a basic human right. Everyone in this room, everyone in our community should have access to quality, affordable healthcare. And we believe that this basic right for healthcare and people's well-being in our community isn't just with respect to being able to get healthcare once you're already sick or ill or injured, but rather entails a commitment to public health, meaning that we have to work to prevent injuries and illnesses and deaths from occurring at all in the first place. And that's particularly why we're concerned about the health and well-being of people in our community with respect to gun violence, because the health of our community is undermined by the epidemic of gun-related injuries and deaths. There's been cases in the media, even in the last week, of domestic violence cases with guns and whatnot, and that's something that we're very concerned about. And many of these injuries and deaths can be easily prevented by the regulation of guns as consumer products. So like prescriptions and pesticides and household chemicals are all inherently dangerous products like guns, that they can't do what they're supposed to do without risking harm to the bystander. But unlike these other inherently dangerous products, or even products like the teddy bear, like Sue will tell you later, guns aren't regulated. And the history of consumer product regulation, the fact that you know that the food that you're getting has been tested by the FDA, that history of consumer protection shows that many deaths and injuries can be prevented by consumer protection. And so as a consumer rights organization and one that has a long history of commitment to public health, gun regulation to us makes perfect sense. And Healthcare Consumers is supporting this legislation that would give the Treasury Department the authority to regulate the design, manufacture, and distribution of guns and ammunition. But one of the things, the perspective that we bring to this issue that may be unique is that we know from the work that we do with the healthcare industry that it often takes people like you and like all of us getting out there and making the government agencies that are supposed to be regulating corporations do their job and do the right thing. Because frequently it has taken state or federal legislation or regulation to make corporations accountable to the consumers and to citizens. And so we believe firmly in a model of participatory democracy that means citizens should be empowered, and that we should all be activists pushing for government to regulate corporations when they won't be responsible and accountable for their own products. And so that's the perspective that we bring to gun regulation, and we have been fortunate enough in the past, I think it's been a year and a half, to have received support from the Consumer Federation of America Foundation through the Joyce Foundation to be able to mobilize local and statewide communities, individuals and organizations, to support this legislation, the Firearms Safety and Consumer Protection Act. And that's part of why we're hosting this here, is that we're hoping, one, to educate you all, but also to make activists out of everyone here, so that at the end of the day we're not just each individually more educated about gun violence, but we're all going to be talking to others, our friends, our family, and co-workers about gun regulation, so eventually we can get this passed and prevent hundreds and thousands of deaths each year through gun violence. So, with that said, I want to turn you over to, actually we're going to show a video clip actually first as an introduction. So what you're going to see is CBS News did a three-part series, the lights on, a three-part series on a family in Montana and the malfunction of Remington rifles. And so this is a good introduction to the issue. It's about 7 minutes long, probably, so. Can everybody see this okay? Is there too much going on?
Government safety investigators now say they're investigating 26 more highway deaths allegedly linked to Firestone tire separations. That brings the number of fatalities under investigation in the Firestone case to 174. Federal safety officials have received more than 6,000 complaints about the tires. In tonight's Eye on America, CBS brings you the results of a hard news investigation into another consumer product. There are allegations this product is defective and it is responsible for death and injury. The product is one of the most popular rifles in America. Correspondent Jim Stewart reports there are serious questions about its safety.
This is the last photograph ever taken of Gus Barber. 1 hour after his mother snapped it last October, the 9-year-old boy lay bleeding to death in her arms. He had been hit by a slug from his mother's Remington Model 700 deer rifle, and Mrs. Barber is very, very clear about one thing.
I pulled the safety off and it fired. The gun went off. My finger was nowhere near the trigger. I had an open hand.
That much she will swear to. The rest is a blur.
I ran around the backside of the trailer and I yelled, "Where's Gus? Where's Gus?" The bullet had hit him, through the hand, and through that.
Rich Barber scooped up his son and the family raced for help.
He told his mother that he was starting to have a hard time breathing and he started turning pale. And I knew it was getting bad at that point.
At a tiny clinic outside Ennis, Montana, the nurses gaped.
And they were shocked to see a beautiful little boy laying there with a hole blown through him. Gus died at the hospital.
You know that a lot of people are going to say you accidentally pulled the trigger. You know that's what they think.
Absolutely not.
It would be easy to assume that this was just another accidental shooting and a grieving family looking to blame anyone but itself. But within hours of Gus's death, the Barber family learned that they were not alone. That this same model rifle had been doing the same thing to others over and over again.
And I hit the safety with my finger off the trigger, and all of a sudden it goes boom.
I just went to take the safety off, and it fired.
The astonishing thing is, no one had connected the dots out here before until the Barber family spoke out about the Remington Model 700 at their church. Immediately, they began to hear from others.
In no time at all, I had 14 people that have experienced the same problem with their firearm.
The same firearm.
M700.
And they all told the same story. Sheriff T. Larson from Medicine Horse.
Took it off safely and the gun discharged.
Jim Van Dale from Bighorn County.
It shot my finger off.
And always the same sequence.
It hit on the safety and it went off.
And it's operated in this manner. To local gunsmith Pete Noreen, who had also seen a Model 700 go off when the safety was disengaged, it was all too familiar.
I had the strangest feeling in my stomach. It choked me up. That I knew what happened.
But what really happened in this tiny community in southwest Montana, we discovered, is not that unique at all. Explore Remington's own records uncovered in a lawsuit as we did, and you'll discover hundreds of similar consumer complaints to the company all about the Model 700. And the question now is, have some gun owners been careless, or is this a potentially deadly, defective product? Tomorrow, some answers. In Montana, this is Jim Stewart for Eye on America.
One more second.
The Consumer Product Safety Commission today announced the recall of 400,000 gun safety locks distributed nationwide by AdStar Incorporated. All told, the commission tested 32 models of what were supposed to be child-proof gun locks. All but 2 types could open without a key. In some cases, it took just a sharp tap on the table. Ironically, while the government can order a recall of defective gun locks, it has no such regulatory power over guns themselves. And while dangerously flawed firearms may be rare, their deadly power makes them a unique threat to anyone in the line of fire. CBS's Jim Stewart has part 2 tonight of our Hard News Eye on America investigation. In the world of firearms, this is an undisputed heavyweight. The Remington Model 700. Cops love it. Hunters have bought 4 million of them. Rich Barber liked it so much, he bought 2.
I laid my money down. I thought I bought a real quality product.
Only now it's become his obsession.
I love you.
3 months ago, Barber's only son, Gus, bled to death from a Model 700 wound. Gus's mother said the 28-year-old gun fired when she flipped the safety off.
The gun went off. My finger was nowhere near the trigger.
And so say 14 other Montanans who responded to the news of Gus's death. The same thing with the same rifle happened to them, they say. It's fair to say, though, that a gun should never go off when you disengage the safety. Why is it called a safety? It should be called a trigger then. Rich Barber wanted to complain about the rifle to someone in government, but he was quick to discover that thanks to a strong lobby, firearms are one of the few products in America which have no government safety or design standards. But there is a very long paper trail on the model gun that killed Gus Barber. The documents surfaced in lawsuits filed by this man, Missouri attorney Rich Miller, who has been dogging complaints against Remington for 16 years.
The last count, we had 1,500 customer complaints of similar malfunctions.
Miller has settled dozens of lawsuits against Remington, each time making essentially the same allegation, that the weapon's fire control system and two-piece trigger connector can be tricked into firing when the safety is engaged.
Guns don't fire unless you pull the trigger is the assumption that everybody begins with. This gun kills people.
And he's not alone in thinking so. Jack Belk is past president of the American Custom Gun Makers Guild.
My old design and function instructor said that trigger was just parts flying in loose formation.
You've known about this problem for how many years?
Since 1969.
Did you tell Remington about it?
Yes.
What'd they say?
So they take it under advisement. I never heard any more from them.
In a written statement to CBS News, Remington said it had looked at the rifle that shot Gus Barber and found the inside of the rifle to be heavily rusted, and the trigger engagement screw, safety lever, and fire control mechanism all had either been adjusted or removed and reinstalled after the rifle left the factory. A spokesman added, however, that Remington is not asserting that this is what caused the discharge and declined to answer additional questions. They specifically had no comment on this 1979 internal memo, which was an exhibit in one of Miller's lawsuits. According to it, as early as then, the company had privately determined that 1% of 2 million early model 700s could be tricked into firing. But Remington concluded that would mean the recall would have to gather 2 million guns just to find the 20,000 that are susceptible to this condition. And that decision, say some experts, could be a huge financial hit.
A lot of people are going to listen to what you have to say and just say, well, here's another anti-gun nut. Here's another person just out to get the guns. That's the furthest thing from the truth, because I don't plan on giving mine up anytime in the near future. This is not an anti-gun issue. This is a gun safety issue. End of conversation.
And just the start of one family's tragedy. In Montana, this is Jim Stewart for Eye on America.
We like to show that piece at the beginning because it's a really good example of what happens when you have an unregulated industry. And it's also a different way for the media to cover this issue, because I think typically when we see stories about guns or gun violence in the media, what do they focus on? They focus on school shootings, high-profile shootings. Occasionally you see some stories about an unintentional shooting or a domestic violence-related shooting. Not so often, but occasionally. But they're often presented as like these isolated incidents, and they're almost always focused on, the user, some bad kid who got a hold of a gun, or it's always the focus is on the people and not on the product. And this was a really good lead-in because they started with the Firestone tire story and then said, here's another consumer product. So it's sort of shifting from the way that we've typically looked at this issue by a focus on the user to the focus on the product and the industry that makes that product. And that's what we're trying to do here today in talking to you about regulating guns as consumer products. Because actually, if you ask most Americans whether or not guns are regulated for health and safety, they'll say, yeah, of course they are. Just like, teddy bears or any other product that's out there. Okay, you wouldn't necessarily say that,
No.
but most Americans would. The polling data actually shows that more than 2/3 of Americans, about 70% of Americans already think that they're regulated for health and safety. But they're not. And so when we start to do this shift, we take more of a public health approach to it, because when you see it as a product that's made by an industry that markets it and makes profit off of it, just like other industries, you start to see that the death and injury related to firearms is much like death and injury from a lot of other products, like automobiles or consumer products found in the home, toys, all these other products, and that you can see patterns in death and injury and the type of death and injury. For example, with guns, the most recent data that's available is called from death certificates around the country, and the most recent year that we have on that data is from 1999, and it showed that nearly 29,000 Americans were killed with guns, and more than twice that number are treated in emergency rooms for gun-related injuries every year. But if you look at the patterns in death and injury, consistently, you see that more than half of all gun deaths are suicide related, and then there are homicides. You've got homicides between people who know each other, oftentimes domestic violence related. Then you have the unintentional deaths, which are often called accidents, but we like to call them unintentionals, because when you think of an accident, think it's something that couldn't be prevented. And part of looking at this as a public health issue is, switching that lexicon that we typically use to show actually, the majority of deaths, whether they be unintentional or not, many of them can be prevented. So you have the unintentional deaths. So you see patterns in death and injury. You also see patterns in the groups that are affected, because there are groups that are disproportionately affected more than others. Men, young men, much more affected than women are, although women now using firearms to kill themselves much more than other types of methods like poison or other types of things, where we found that women are much more likely to attempt suicide and men are much more likely to complete. Women are actually now catching up because they're more likely to use guns today than they were a couple of decades ago. And you also see patterns in the type of firearms that are used. Because long guns, rifles and shotguns, actually outnumber handguns 2 to 1 in the United States in terms of ownership rates. But handguns are overwhelmingly used in death and injury. They're involved in about 80% of all deaths and injuries in the U.S. as compared to long guns. So there are patterns when we start to take a look at this in this different way. But I'm talking in kind of generalities here: long guns, rifles, shotguns versus handguns. And why is that? Because another aspect of a lack of regulation is the fact that we don't have a lot of specific information on death and injury. This is very unusual to talk about the Remington Model 700. You asked me, well, how many Remington Model 700s are involved in suicides or in homicide? We don't know that data because we don't collect that data, and it's appalling. With the Firestone tire, probably a lot of you saw in your local paper or on the news. Here's the make and model of the tire. Here's where you look for the serial number. You had on this particular piece the exact number of consumer complaints we've gotten so far on that. And why is that? That's because the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration collects that data, and we were able to get to the public very reasonably quickly. To say, here it is, and then also we have this agency that can make Firestone accountable and force them to do a recall. But with these, we don't have that data, whether they be, and this we only get because of stories like this, and also because of lawsuits that are brought up against the companies after somebody's already been killed or injured, which is really the only recourse that consumers presently have. And it's ridiculous. With other types of products, you get a refund, you get it repaired. There's something that consumers can get when they have a defective product, and there's nothing like that for guns. Remington has never done a recall. You have some other companies that have done limited recalls. Ruger actually has a handgun that's called the old model Ruger, and it's subject to drop fire, meaning if you unintentionally bump it against something or drop it on the ground. There have been more than 600 cases where people have been killed or injured. And again, we know those 600 because of the lawsuits. But what happens when you don't have regulation is the companies end up writing these lawsuits into their bottom line. So there's not much of a disincentive for them to stop their irresponsible behavior. So these are all aspects of the unregulated industry and what we're looking at now. So what are we talking about? What can health and safety regulation get us? We actually support, there is federal legislation now called the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act. And this bill would give the Department of Treasury Health and Safety Consumer Protection Authority over guns and ammunition. And we've seen over the decades that Consumer Protection Authority over other types of products has actually reduced death and injury from those products. The National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, for example, was formed more than 30 years ago, the mid-1960s, and since that time, deaths from automobile crashes have gone down by nearly half. About 250,000 lives have been prevented as a result of health and safety standards that have been developed under NHTSA. Same with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. They've been around since the early 1970s, and since that time, deaths from consumer-related products, they oversee more than 15,000 products in the home, and those deaths have gone down by nearly half as well. So it works, and we think it would also work very well for guns, because again, everything that we talk about when we talk about gun control or legislation that we introduce, it focuses on the user, and that's exactly what the gun industry wants us to focus on,
because for a couple of different reasons. One is they want to keep that mentality of blaming the user. You saw Remington's reaction there. Oh, your gun was rusty, you didn't take care of it properly. If we did the same thing with Firestone Tire, or you weren't driving your car correctly, or, people would have just been, appalled. And instead, so they want to do it for that reason. And, and then the other reason is, of course, they don't want to be, accountable. They want to keep the focus on the user, because the less we focus on them, the more they can just continue with their behavior as pro forma. So there's that, and this legislation would basically do with the gun industry what we've done with all other product-related industries, except for guns and tobacco, the last two bastions there, friendly products. And what it would do is it would allow Treasury to set minimum health and safety standards. For teddy bears, we often use this analogy because it's a great analogy. We've got this soft and fuzzy product here, and this other product which we have no health and safety standards for the domestic manufacture of firearms. And we say domestic manufacture, and this, by the way, is a replica. This is not a real firearm. So, in case any of you are like, okay, watch where you're pointing that. We actually do have some limited health and safety standards for guns that we bring into this country. The reason why that came about is probably many of you remember Saturday night specials in the 1960s. We had a lot of problems with Saturday night specials. At that time, they were all imports, and so we set up standards, ironically, for the handguns that we import into this country. And then what happened? We had domestic manufacturers that started making them. So we actually have stronger standards for imported firearms than we do for domestically produced firearms. But with teddy bears, we have at least 4 federal health and safety standards that cover teddy bears. We want to make sure there are no components on here that a small child could choke on, no sharp points, that this is inflammable, and that's not made out of any hazardous materials. So there's quite a lot of things, and very few children have been killed over the years from teddy bears. There have been a couple kids, unfortunately, a couple of deaths, mostly due to companies that still put on pieces that a child can choke on. That's usually how it's happened, but very, very small number. And so one of the things that this legislation would do is it would give Treasury the ability to set minimum health and safety standards for firearms, for ammunition, also for non-powder firearms. Those would include things like putting on devices like safety devices that many of you might have heard about, like magazine disconnect devices that prevent the firearm from firing if the magazine is taken out of the gun. Load indicators. Oftentimes what happens in homicides or unintentional shootings is people don't know there's still a cartridge that's in the chamber. And so someone ends up, a lot of times when kids are playing around, somebody's showing off their firearm. That's how it happens. Very simple, very inexpensive safety devices that are already out there, the industry already knows about, but they just don't put them on because nobody's making them. So things like that, size standards, which is what we have for imported handguns right now. I was talking about those Saturday night specials, which we're no longer able to import, but we make them here. And having those guns, which is what the industry has been doing in recent years, is they've been innovating with lethality. And so it allows people to carry firearms on them, to bring them into the workplace, bring them into the school. So the smaller they are, the more powerful they are, the easier they are to take somewhere and kill somebody with. So those types of standards are what, under this legislation, Treasury could take a look at to try to bring down deaths and injuries. Another thing that it would allow Treasury to do would be to issue recalls and warnings, which is what we're talking about with the Remington problem. Right now, the industry is not required to do recalls, so any recalls that they do are voluntary. I mentioned the old model Ruger. Ruger actually did do a voluntary recall, and occasionally you still see that recall from time to time in gun magazines, but it's very limited. It's not, it's not on the page of your local paper. It's not, in any magazines that you would necessarily pick up at your local store unless you, subscribe to gun magazines. And as a result, there are still about 1.1 million old model Rugers in the hands of consumers, and every year there are still incidents that come up. They still get sued, they're still renting into their bottom line, and they do no type of mandatory recall. You can get a voluntary retrofit if you want, but that's basically the only recourse that they have. So it would allow for that. It would allow for warnings. We know about the risks of guns in the home for domestic violence, for suicide, all these types of things, and it will allow us to put warnings on them, just like we put warnings on toys and say this toy may contain small parts, don't give it to a child under 3 years old. Also allow us to do more comprehensive data collection. It's really hard to actually set standards, to even introduce legislation when we're talking in generalities. It's like we're all, we're just talking about handguns as a class, or just firearms as a class in general, or assault weapons, these types of things. It would allow us to collect data on a more comprehensive basis to bring in, how many domestic violence related incidents are there each year that involve firearms. We have some limited data for the FBI, but we don't know what's the make and model that are involved in those incidents. Are there warnings that we can give the public about specific guns, having them in a home? Those types of things, that would allow us to affect more comprehensive policy. And, and then lastly, it would allow us to ban products if there's no other regulatory remedy that's available. It's not just, it's a very specific standard that Treasury would have to meet. Just like CPSC, there could not be any other regulatory remedy that could be applied, and it would have to present such a risk to the general public, taking in mind that it's an inherently dangerous consumer product, that there's nothing else that you could possibly do to protect the public. So those two standards, very high standard. So those are all the different things that it could do. Right now we have more than 60 national and state and local groups that are on this legislation, including groups like the American Public Health Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, NAACP, lots of state and local groups too. And we're in the process of trying to build support as much as possible for this. Our CFA Foundation is proud and happy to work with groups like Champaign County, and we have a number of other consumer groups across the country that we're working with to educate consumers about this and educate policymakers about it. And we're really, really happy to see the great turnout here. So, thanks.
My name is Catherine Griffiths, and I'm the Midwest Regional Director for the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence. And I've just got a brief statement from our organization. We're thrilled to be working with Champaign County Healthcare Consumers, who does so much work on other issues, and with the Consumer Federation of America on the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act. I think it's very important. The Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, which is the largest and oldest statewide gun violence prevention group in the country, stands along with CFA and healthcare consumers in full support of the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act. We're encouraging every member of the Illinois congressional delegation to pledge their support to this common sense initiative. At a time when nearly every consumer product sold in stores throughout the country is regulated for basic health and safety standards, it's simply unconscionable that the most deadly consumer product continues to be subject to no federal health or safety regulations. The history of consumer product regulation has taught us that deaths and injuries to the American public have been reduced as a result of basic health and safety standards. This issue is not solely the concern of gun violence prevention groups. We recognize the importance of going to other constituencies who are also affected by this issue. All of us, gun owners and non-gun owners alike, deserve protection in terms of health and safety standards for firearms in the United States. As you see here today, consumer advocates and all of you here in this room are stepping up and calling for regulation of the renegade industry that produces millions of lethal products every year in the United States. And we believe that the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act can help implement some simple measures to reduce the risk for those Americans who choose to purchase firearms, as well as those who do not. For example, the Department of the Treasury, under the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act, will be able to require a baseline level of pounds of pressure in order to successfully pull a trigger on a handgun or a long gun. This could help reduce the number of children ages 8 and under who unintentionally injure or kill themselves or others when they come across a gun in their homes or the homes of their friends. Such a device may have saved the life of 6-year-old Kayla Rowland of Michigan, who was killed by a classmate who found a gun at home and brought it to school. The Department of the Treasury could also mandate such devices as loading indicators for all guns to let gun users know if there's a cartridge still in the chamber of a firearm. Such a precaution would have saved the life of 15-year-old Kenzo Dix of Berkeley, California, who was also killed by a friend showing off his father's 9mm Beretta. His friend was familiar with firearms and had removed the loaded magazine from the gun and inserted an empty one in order to demonstrate the gun firing. And sadly, the friend didn't realize there was one cartridge left in the bullet in the gun's chamber, and when he pointed the gun at his friend and pulled the trigger, he killed his friend Kenzo. The technology does exist to implement these simple measures, as Sue had said, as we've seen on the report here on the television. The technology is out there. These are simple measures to implement, and the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act would give the Department of the Treasury the authority to make sure that the gun industry follows through on these health and safety measures. And for these reasons and many others, we believe that the Firearm Safety and Consumer Protection Act is an essential piece of legislation that would protect all consumers. Regulation of America's gun industry is possible, and if we work together here in this room, across the state, across the country, we can make it happen. So, thank you.
If anyone has any questions, I think we're open to those.
Yeah, I wonder why it's being put under Treasury. I guess they have Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which sounds like all the real dangerous stuff gets put under Treasury, so they can't do anything. So is there any discussion of putting it under the Consumer Protection? Because they already have the mechanism to do these things?
Actually, the national consumer groups, our Consumer Federation of America, U.S. PIRG, and Consumers Union, considered that. And we actually would oppose CPSC authority for a couple of different reasons, and feel that Treasury is the more appropriate agency to put it under. Actually, the bill designates the Secretary of the Treasury, so the Secretary could do whatever they feel is appropriate, whether giving the authority, working with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, setting up another entity within Treasury, or keeping it within the Office of the Secretary. So it's not necessarily just ATF, but it is true that the Department of the Treasury has a much higher level of expertise on this, on guns. As I mentioned before, they do some, oh, follow my coffee. Do some limited health and safety testing of imported firearms. They have that expertise. They certainly have a lot more funding than CPSC does. The committee in Congress, the Commerce Committee, that CPSC falls under, is not as friendly a committee from a political standpoint in trying to get authority under CPSC. And also, I mean, there have been efforts in the last couple of decades to get rid of the agency a couple of times, CPSC. They have been underfunded for years, have not come up to, and they also actually have a much more prohibitive process, because in the 1980s, when there was a movement towards deregulation, their process got muddled, so that it's very hard to actually set standards through CPSC. So there's a lot of different reasons. That's a very common question. We get that frequently, because you figure, well, a gun is sort of a household item in many ways, so why wouldn't it fall under CPSC? And they don't really have expertise at all in this area, so it would be a whole new level of expertise for them. They already, as I mentioned before, oversee 15,000 consumer products, and that pulls them in a lot of different directions as it is, and a lot of those are child-related products, and they would have to shift a lot of their resources to develop expertise in this area. So, sure.
Could you, in a nutshell, I know you're here to educate us. You did a great job. Okay, I'm ready to go out and educate my community. But beyond education, what is it specifically you need us to do?
Wow. we actually, we're going to talk about that. We just sort of wanted to keep it open to any questions on the substance of what we talked about, but that was a great segue. Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be. Now I'm all fired up. I'm mad at Remington. Okay.
All right.
Because they understand that if they don't, what's the shirt say? Power concedes nothing without a demand. So if we don't demand that they do regulatory things, they're not going to volunteer. I'm all fired up. I just had to make sure you were going to give me somewhere to go.
Is it okay if I go ahead and answer that? Yeah, okay, we'll try for it. So some of the things that we can do here locally, and again, I'm glad you asked that, because that's why we brought everyone together, is we wanted to get y'all fired up and ready to do things. So one of the things that's in your packet is a white sheet. It's toward the very, very back. And what this is a way for especially organizations to support the legislation. And I know so many of you gave one affiliation you have, but I know there's also 3 or 4 different organizations that everyone's involved in. This is something really important that you can take back to your organization to have them sign on to the legislation. Not to pick on you, Martine, but for instance, Martine's here from the Illinois Disciples Foundation, which signed on to the legislation, I think it was about a year ago. And so, that was part of the process involved, was then everyone within that organization is educated about the issue, and we can put on our list of co-sponsors and supporters that entire foundation. That's what we're looking to do with a lot of organizations here in Champaign County. So this is something you take back to your organization, and don't feel like you have to be able to give the speech that Sue just gave to you back to your organization. You can feel free to call on us here at Healthcare Consumers, and we'd be happy to send myself or someone else to talk to your organization about the issue. I'm sure I can't do what Sue did, but I'm sure we could invite someone from our Speakers Bureau to come and talk to your organization. Another thing that you can do is these fact sheets, distribute them to people. If the color ones don't copy well, let me know. I can get you the text version. Feel free to send those out over your email announcement list. So if, for instance, you're involved in an organization that works specifically on domestic violence, there's a domestic violence fact sheet. Feel free to forward that on. If you're from the schools or work with youth, use the one on guns and youth. Find a way to make this issue really connect with the people that you see in your daily lives. And again, take this back to your friends and your family and your coworkers. Tell them what you learned here today. And then you and everyone you talk to urge to contact your representatives and let them know that this is an issue that's really important to you, and that you're going to be paying attention how they act on this issue, and that there really is a community here that's interested.
I think also just first and foremost, I think we'd like to create some organization around this, coalition building, because, it's one thing to sort of tell people individually, contact your member. I think we'd like to do that in an organized way and in a targeted way, because that obviously has the most power. So, one of the things that Brooke did on the sign-in sheet, I think, was to ask people to check off if you want to get more information. I think part of that is we'd like to set up a listserv. So if there's anybody here, actually I would ask if there's anybody here who wouldn't like to be a part of that listserv to let, Brooke know, but that otherwise we would love to include you all on a listserv so that we can, just get to you all at once and say, okay, we're organizing this, we're going to do a letter writing campaign this next week, or we're going to do a visit to a town meeting, or, or have another meeting like this to just talk to you about something that's upcoming, or organize around if there is, a high-profile shooting that we want to respond to as a community, or things like that, so we can do it in an organized and targeted way. I'm sorry, did you want to?
Now, my question was, every time you start talking to somebody about gun or gun control, you get the answer, if we do this, they're going to take away my right under the Constitution. And it seems to me the question, of course, is even if you want to have a gun, it ought to be safe. And we aren't saying we take away cars just because Firestone is related. And the gun argument, and I always think Charlton Heston up there, who's saying that we're going to lose our right for guns. So I don't know how we can do it, but we can. Well, you have to say it. They need to be safe. Those of you who want them and those of you who don't want them. There still need to be regulations. Listen to Sarah Brady sometime.
Yeah, that was sort of one of my, the area I was wondering about, because to me it just makes total common sense to do this, but I'm sure there's opposition out there. And I guess I would just like to know, sort of what is their basis for opposition as far as just regulating the safety of it? And what is their argument against doing that, so I can be a little more prepared?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, both of you. I think that, whenever you're talking anything about guns, there's always that slippery slope, which is ironic because, the NRA started out as pretty much a hunters organization, and and now they've become, this anti-gun control organization, so anything, and I have family members who belong to the NRA, and they're not represented by the national organization, which is, like I said, become this rabid anti, my cousin doesn't, thinks the assault weapons ban,
There's the key. You need to get members of the NRA to start supporting gun safety. And maybe we would get some
But I think what's different about this approach, which is really good, you know, from our perspective, is that this forces groups like the NRA to have to defend the gun industry. Because we're not talking about individual gun owners here, like we are with a lot of other types of gun control, you know, it really puts them in a position. And typically their response, you know, when I've done this kind of stuff is, you know, well, we already have 20,000 gun laws on the books. Guns are the most heavily regulated product that's out there. And I say, but you know what? None of those laws that are on the books have anything to do with health and safety regulation. Guns aren't regulated for health and safety. And then there's really not much of a response to that, except for then they go into Second Amendment. And I typically, you know, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not, you know, and I say that to people, I say, you know, I'm no legal scholar, but as far as I know, there's never been a gun control law that's been struck down by the Supreme Court on Second Amendment grounds that you have some individual right. This legislation is not, you know, going to impede on an individual right to own a gun in any way, because the Second Amendment doesn't mean that. And they may think that, and the NRA, much to their credit, they've done a great job of convincing the American public that people do have an individual right. And you know, I just don't get into that argument with people. I just say this is, you know, that's generally used as a smokescreen to sort of avoid the substance of what we're really talking about here. And what we're talking about here is protecting consumers, all consumers, gun owning and non-gun owning. And that's the bottom line. And if you don't support that, why not? What are you back in the industry? What are you know, why are you doing that? You know, and then what are they going to say? And my experience of that is they don't really have much that they can say, which is good. You know.
The point is, you don't care if people own guns. It's just that we don't want your gun to kill you, or kill your family member, or endanger your neighbors. Bullets go through walls just as easy as through hands.
Right.
And they say guns don't kill people. People kill people. Have you heard that 10,000 times?
Yeah.
The gun is broken, Mike.
Right. That'll work. That argument will work if the gun is made according to strict regulations. And when I remove the safety, as in Remington, I don't blow my child away. Think I killed my child.
Right.
But because Remington did not have regulations on it, because there was no regulations at all in law, the gun did kill my son. And I think just by what we saw and heard today, we kind of equipped any kind of silly arguments we might run into out there for yo gung-ho NRA. You know, it's like, hey man, I want a gun, but I don't want my gun to blow up in my face. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact sheets, I think, address a lot of the questions, but I think it's, you know, if you have stuff that you end up encountering, for those of you who get involved in this, let us know if you get some question that you don't really know how to respond to. I mean, that's what we're here for, and, you know, well, because we ought to have that information for you, and if we don't, we'll get it. Because we don't want people out there, like, not really sure of what to say, and at the same time, I think it's important not to get involved, you know, in arguments that just sort of lead you nowhere. Like that Second Amendment thing, it's just forget it. You know, I just slough it off, I answer it really quickly, and if they keep pressing on it, I just say, hey, don't you have any substantive thing, you know, don't you have anything of substance you want to talk about? You're just talking about the Second Amendment thing, and that's, you know, the bottom line with that is that this is not going to get in the way of it. And with the inherently dangerous argument, I mean, I just always bring up lots of other inherently dangerous consumer products that you use that are regulated every day. Pesticides, household cleaners, your prescription drugs, all those things are regulated, and, you know, they've reduced death and injury as a result of it, and we think we can do the same thing with guns. And it can have an effect. I mean, as Brooke brought up, you know, I know there are some of you who are here from women's organizations, domestic violence groups, or work on that as an issue. And, you know, the gun industry, because of the lack of health and safety regulation I've talked about, they've innovated lethality. They've also done, you know, what the cigarette industry has been doing. You know, for decades they've increased their marketing to women and to kids. And there's this whole rap, you know, you need a gun to protect yourself against the stranger who's going to attack you. And all of us know, you know, it's much more dangerous to have a gun in the home because women are much more likely to be attacked by someone who's known to them. And these are the types of things that health and safety regulation afford us, because we can educate consumers a lot more when there is that authority there. The Violence Policy Center, which is a national gun control organization that we work pretty closely with, just put out this study recently. It's called When Men Murder Women, an analysis of 1999 homicide data. And they put it out every year in October, because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So for any of you that are interested in receiving this, I think all of these are opportunities to just kind of keep pounding home the point. The gun industry is unregulated. Here are just more and more examples of what happens when you have this unregulated industry. When there's a school shooting, when there's a domestic violence related shooting, yes, there needs to be accountability on parents having guns in the home and all of that. But also, what kind of message are we sending? When we have this unregulated industry to consumers out there, we're saying that the gun industry ought to have no responsibility over the fact that kids have access to guns all over this country. Because we got bad apple gun dealers out there that are just selling through straw purchasing, and they have no qualms about, at gun shows, selling to kids, all these types of things. And this is what regulation would do. It's not just making sure that the products that they put out there aren't defective to take care of the Remington. I mean, that's a good argument that works for you all in the areas that have the highest gun ownership rates. But certainly, we want to look at all aspects of the distribution, at the marketing, all of these different aspects of it. Because that's what we do with everything else.
Can states do anything about this, or is it strictly federal?
Well, Massachusetts actually has authority through their Attorney General. But the campaign that they launched in order to make that happen, they had support basically at every level of state government there, so it's a little bit unique. And it also requires, if you're going to do something at the state level, then you need to have the expertise in order to do it. So it's difficult to accomplish this at the state level, and also, you run into kind of a patchwork, as we do with a lot of other, gun control laws at the state level. If you have it in one state, then, no state here, aside from Hawaii, is an island, and you get affected by all the other states that are around you. So, it has happened at the state level, but it's a very difficult campaign to launch, and that's why we're trying to do this on the federal level, because, and also, doing something like this, it encompasses a lot of other quote-unquote gun control initiatives. Every time that we legislate something, typically with gun control, the industry finds ways, they find loopholes that you can basically drive a truck through. So then you have to re-legislate. With the assault weapons ban, that's a perfect example. We legislated that a specific list of firearms were banned. So what did the industry do? They changed a characteristic here and there on their gun, they changed the name of the gun, and it was out on the market, within a year. What do we have to do then? Well, then you have to re-legislate it, and you know how hard that is to do. If you have a regulatory agency that finds a hole, in a tire that's made, or a car, or, a refrigerator, or whatever, you don't have to legislate every time. You can say, hey, let's fix it now. Any other questions? Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
We have two more handouts for those of you who are interested. We have a list of the co-sponsors that are currently on the bill. The House sponsors are on the front, and then we only have one co-sponsor right now in the Senate. And we also have a list of national and state and local groups that are on the bill. So.
Take one of these and pass it down. That'd be great. You just take one and pass it down.
Stop.
Can I get you to take one and pass it down?
No, I just want to know if you want me to stop now.
Yeah, you can stop. Yeah.